I have spent the past 2 summers guiding canoe trips in Lake of the Woods in Minnesota, and I have had a few run-ins and heard many stories from other guides about their experiences. The beings have lived in this area for thousands of years, and there are many places that we cannot camp on because they are Indian reservations. I have heard this area is referred to as Wendigo country, and there are multiple places named after it, like the Wendigo Isles, for example. I have plenty of stories that have passed on by other guides, which are pretty terrifying, and I could share some with you if there is interest, but I will just share this one experience I was involved in. It was me, another guide, and we had about 7 kids with us on this trip. On the first night, we stopped after a long day of paddling at a campsite known as Little Triscuit. We had one camper with us that was somewhere on the autism spectrum and had big communication issues. As we were making dinner over the fire, he seemed to notice something in the woods behind us. He kept saying things along the lines of, "Who is that man in the woods?" and described it as a tall, skinny man that was all white. We assured him that there was no one there, and that we did a head count to make sure that everybody was here. So, we checked it out and we didn't see anything, so we just brushed it off and went back to making dinner. The same night, a different camper was in her tent by herself because she was the only girl on our trip. As me and my co-guide were starting to fall asleep, we heard her say, "Gilly Vanilli, stop." We replied with, "What? We're in her tent." And she just brushed it off and went to bed. In the morning, we asked her what was up, and she said that something was shaking her tent, and she thought it was us. It wasn't a windy night. The boys were all in their tents, and we were in our tents as well. When we took her tent down, we took the stakes out, and 2 of them were completely bent at a 90-degree angle. We tested out the flexibility, and we couldn't move and get the thing to budge back at all. I've been in some crazy windstorms out there, probably with winds of around 30 to 40 miles per hour, and had never seen a stake bend like that. But we left Little Triscuit and the weird stuff stopped happening, and we had an awesome trip afterwards. When we got back to base camp, I talked to another guide that stayed at the same campsite the night after, and without me saying anything, she told me there is some sort of big white creature at that campsite. She told us that she was going to the bathroom way back in the woods and thought that another camper had accidentally came to her bathroom spot and ran away, but when she got back, everybody was there and nobody had even left the fire in the time that she had left. There are much scarier stories and experiences other guides have been involved in with these spirits up here. Ever since I could remember, I've loved hunting. Squirrels, deer. It started as something my father and I did together, but when he died, I couldn't help but see myself out there more and more. It was his favorite thing to do, and I was lucky enough to be a part of it with him. God knows I miss him so much. After the following experience, though, I'm scared to head back out to the woods. It was a snowy Saturday morning looking back, and the sun had just come up. That day, I had been hunting squirrels, but the woods were deathly quiet and still. I sat silently under the skeleton of an old oak tree. Whether or not I saw or killed anything didn't matter. The best part was the beauty. Waking up early and soaking it all in was worth every second of quiet and coldness. Everything was suddenly stirred to life by a gruff, grunting sound. The noise was similar to a buck call at first, but so much lower and guttural. At first, I thought a massive buck was dying in the snow. Then it came again, but close enough to make my blood run cold. Whatever it was wasn't dying. It had moved an impossible amount of distance within those few seconds. I honestly had no idea what I was hearing. I did the only thing I could do, and I sat still and tried not to breathe. Only moments later, I saw something that has changed my life in the worst way possible. The head of a deer with a sickly look and eyes with way too much white appeared from behind a tree 15 yards in front of me. It was motionless, And worst of all, the damn thing was 9 feet off the ground, and I've never seen any deer that tall. This thing looked like it had just been in a fight while fighting off a deadly virus. It wasn't a pretty sight to see. When a clawed hand appeared just below it, I knew this was no deer. It sounds like something out of a children's book of scary stories, I know, and I wish that was all true, but these bony fingers curved around the trunk of the tree, disgusting nails sliding along the bark. The way its head was angled, it was as if it was staring at me, into my soul. Instinct then took over. I grabbed my gun and I ran as quickly as possible back to my truck. I had never ran so fast before in my life, but somehow I still ran faster when I heard that grunting again. Closer and closer it seemed to come, no matter how far I ran away. When I reached my truck, I opened and slammed the door shut. I started it and floored the damn thing. But before I really took off, I made one mistake. I glanced into the woods. As if it had been copied and pasted, that thing's decaying head and clawed hand were now protruding from a pine tree at the forest's edge. I'm sorry, Dad, but I don't know if I'll ever be going back there ever again. One summer, about 5 to 6 years ago, Stephen had a couple of encounters with a Wendigo. His first encounter was on an earlier trip in the summer where their destination was into Shoal Lake. It was a 6-day trip which had about 60 miles of paddling and one portage, taking your packs and canoes over land into another lake, into Shoal. On day 4, they were portaging back out of Shoal through a portage called Dead Man's Portage. Sounds made up from some horror story, right? But the portage from Lake of the Woods into Shoal is called Dead Man's Portage. No idea why they call it that, but it's quite fitting. There was a campsite that is pretty frequently used about half a mile from the portage. We just called this campsite Dead Man's. Stephen and his trip left Shoal Lake, aiming to get through Dead Man's Portage and stay at the campsite right after it. It's a little long, but a nice highway of a portage without too many ups and downs. I believe the Canadian Park Service even cleans out this portage, which may be the only one that is frequently maintained in Lake of the Woods. The short paddle from the portage to the campsite is just a surreal, beautiful paddle the whole entire way. It's through a little inlet with about 10 to 15 foot high cliffs on both sides, covered in moss and beautiful cedars. Stephen and his trip got to Dead Man's campsite, and later on, just before they were going to bed, they discovered they left their sleeping bag pack at the end of the portage. It was around 9 or so it was getting pretty dark by this point. Stephen and a camper set off in a canoe with their headlamps to quickly retrieve the pack. The paddle took them about half an hour, and at this point you could really only see what your headlamp was shining on. They grabbed the pack and started to head back. Shortly after leaving, Stephen started to hear loud splashes of things falling in the water, trailing behind them. He quickly dismissed it at first because beavers are pretty common in the area, and when they slap their tails it sounds pretty identical to a huge rock being chucked into the water. But the splashes kept going and were right on his back as they kept paddling. Stephen looked behind him to see a huge rock the size of a basketball come flying at him and land in the water at his side. They began to paddle like crazy to get back to the campsite and away from whatever was chucking these giant, super heavy rocks at them. Stephen looked back between paddles, and on one of the cliffs, about 15 feet up, he saw 2 distinct red glowing eyes on top of it. The rocks stopped coming at them and they made it back okay. The rest of their trip went along nicely without any other encounters, but I never feel too great about going through Dead Man's Portage. And triple check that I don't leave any packs there when I do. My father owns a small delivery service that operates out of Farmington. We mostly deliver small packages out to the middle of nowhere that are too much of a hassle for the larger delivery companies to bother with. My dad is the only employee, and we have a few pickup trucks and a trailer. One day, we get a delivery out to Window Rock, Arizona, on the Navajo Reservation, which is about 2 hours from Farmington. My dad gets the call for the job while he is chilling with his Navajo friend, Travis, and his girlfriend. Travis mentions how he's got family in Window Rock that he hasn't seen in ages and suggests they go with him. I was about 6 or 7 at the time, and it was the summertime, so Dad decides we'll go down together. He can do his delivery really quick, and then while Travis sees his family, we can go check out the Window Rock, which is, for those who don't know, a big rock face with a large hole in it that goes to the other side. It's pretty cool. We had to convoy in separate trucks since my dad's was loaded down with freight. We decided to bring along some talkie-talkies so we could communicate with one another. We spend our time in Window Rock. Everything is generally uneventful, and we start heading home along the old highway with my father and I in front, and Travis and his girlfriend in their truck behind us. I honestly don't remember most of Window Rock trip, but this next part I can never forget. We're somewhere on the highway between Window Rock and Gallup. It had just rained earlier in the day, and the road was kind of slick, so we were taking it pretty slow. On the left side of the highway, there is nothing but sandstone cliffs, and on the right side, there is a huge field separated from the road by a small barbed wire fence. We crest the top of this hill, and down at the bottom of the hill, we see what appears to be a very large dog just sitting back on its haunches in the middle of the road, facing the cliffs. My dad calls over the radio, "Hey Travis, do you see that big-ass dog?" Travis starts yelling back over the radio, "That is not a dog, speed up right now and hit it." He sounds almost hysterical. He just keeps screaming, "Hit it! You have to hit it, please, please, hit that fucking thing right now." So, my dad starts to speed up, and as we get a bit closer, I begin to see it a little more clearly. It's covered in this brown, wiry, matted hair that appears to have dried blood all over it. It's still facing the cliffs, but the moment our headlights hit it, it turns and looks right at us, and it has a face. I don't know how else to describe it other than a mix between a bear's and a human's face. It looks twisted and distorted and almost in pain. As we get closer to this thing, we start to realize it's actually pretty huge. Though it was still sitting on its haunches, it is about shoulder height with the hood of the truck. We get literally inches from hitting it when it lets out this scream that sounds like someone screaming as their lungs were filling with water, and it leaps backwards, towards the field, landing just on our side of the barbed wire fence. Then, with another leap, it was gone from sight. Travis's comes in over the radio again. "Holy shit, keep driving, we have to get out of here, we have to go faster." He kept repeating that last part, "We have to get out of here, and we have to go faster." Pretty soon, we are speeding like crazy, and just as we start to come near the outskirts of Gallup, we get pulled over. Travis pulls his truck over with us. Naturally, this makes the cop, a Navajo man himself, very on edge, and he immediately asks why Travis felt the need to pull over as well. Travis says, "We just saw a skinwalker a few miles back, and it's been following us." The officer immediately turns white, stammers something about a verbal warning, gets in his car and takes off. We do the same. We didn't see anything else that night, but when we got home, Travis refused to let us leave without taking some kind of Navajo totem thing that was supposed to keep it away. Anybody that has been on the Navajo reservation has either probably heard of some creepy things or have experienced pretty creepy things, namely skinwalkers. I have only seen one. Here's my story. I come from a small town in northern Arizona that's kind of sandwiched between the CRPYTID reservation to the north and the U.S. largest Navajo reservation to the south. My high school being so small, a 1A high school that has on average 80 students enrolled every year, always had to travel south about 5 to 10 hours one way to play another high school in any sport. This means that we traveled a lot on the Navajo reservation, and we also usually stayed at hotels when we would head out to play and come home in the morning, but this trip was a little bit different. I remember the basketball coach saying that the school didn't have enough money to put up the teams in a hotel that trip, so we were going to be on the road for a total of about 12 hours. I was the only male senior to play basketball that season. We had just got done playing our big game and headed home on our bus, Big Blue. We were headed out and it wasn't long, about 2 hours of driving before we had entered the res. And by this time, everyone was asleep with it being about 2 in the morning. When we had crossed the res's border, I noticed the bus driver had sped up and was now going about 85 miles an hour. I thought this was a little weird because he never exceeded the speed limit, at least not in my high school career. But for some reason, I just couldn't fall asleep like the rest of my teammates, and I just sat at the back of the bus, staring out across the desolate desert landscape that was lit up by the full moon. As I looked out, I could see a figure running towards the bus at an angle of a pursuit, and keeping up with the bus at 85 miles an hour. As the figure got closer, I saw that it was a humanoid form. As a matter of fact, it looked exactly like a human, only that the face was painted half black and half white with glowing eyes. Glowing eyes like a rabbit's eyes, reflecting light from a spotlight. I immediately thought, oh my god, it's a skinwalker. The skinwalker ran up to the edge of the road and just kept up pace with the bus, hurdling sagebrush and rocks while staring right at me. After I made eye contact with the thing, I could not look away. It was as if something was holding my head and eyes in place. The skinwalker just smiled at me, this inhumane smile that went ear to ear, showing crooked yellow pointed teeth. I felt like I was going to throw up and I was panicking throughout the whole ordeal. The skinwalker started to crumble down on all fours, still keeping up with the bus. I could see his bones crack and reform. Hair started appearing all over the skinwalker's body, and in about 3 seconds was now a coyote, and it ran off back into the desert out of view. As soon as it was gone, I ran to the onboard bathroom and puked a mixture of food and blood. I didn't want to tell anyone for fear they would think I was crazy. I confided in my Navajo friend. She told me that I needed to see the chief, who also happened to be a friend of mine, and get a blessing. I saw him the next school day in the parking lot. He just came up to me and mumbled something in Navajo while waving a feathered scepter-like thing. Turned around, got in his truck, and drove away. To this day, I haven't seen another skinwalker since. It might be due to the fact I moved away from that town and the res. And if I do have to go south, I go around. Way around. This all happened about 5 or so years ago. One night, a few of my friends decided after a night of hanging out that we'd go on an adventure at about 3 a.m. We took a ride about 50 miles to this old Spanish ruins in New Mexico. That was once the seat of the Inquisition. I can't for the life of me remember what the place is called, but anyway. So we jumped the front gate to the palace and started exploring. One of my friends brought a flute with him, and he started playing it, and about 30 seconds into his mediocre playing, something started screaming really, really loud on the tops of the long destroyed walls of the place. It was going from wall to wall really quick, screaming the most blood-curdling scream you've ever imagined. We noped the fuck out of there, and one of my friends pissed his pants and drove for a few hours to Bandelier National Monument, where we planned to camp out for the rest of the weekend. We got to Bandelier at probably like 6 or 7 a.m. and then we set up our camp. After a few hours just talking about what the hell happened at the ruins, I went to take a piss behind it, probably only like 300 feet from our camp. This is where everything starts getting a little fuzzy. I remember seeing 2 dust devils coming my way, and when I turned around again, 2 of my friends were there, and they were motioning me to follow them. I couldn't help but to follow them, like I was being pulled behind them in shackles. I followed them for what seemed like 10 or 15 minutes, and then I snapped out of it. These weren't my friends. They had bright red hair with my friends' faces and cat eyes. Both of these friends were brunette. I stopped walking and they looked at me with probably the most terrifying gaze I've ever seen. Monsters in movies are nothing compared to this. I turned around and ran as fast as I could back the way I came from. After like 5 minutes of a full sprint, I got back to that rock that I pissed at and found our camp. Everybody was sitting there, still sitting around, talking, and didn't even notice that I was even gone. I told them what had happened with the look-alike skinwalkers, and we packed up everything and left probably within like 10 minutes and got the hell back to Albuquerque. I was a kid when this happened. My uncle and I were finishing up chopping and gathering firewood for my grandmother because it was getting dark. Driving back on a dirt road at about 30 miles an hour, give or take 5 miles an hour. I had this awful sense of just being watched. Before I could turn to look out my window, which was the passenger side, my uncle quickly shouted, "Don't!" I completely froze. My heart felt like it was beating out of my chest and then completely stopped when I heard a tap-tap on my window. My uncle sped up and was loudly praying in my native language. I didn't know what was going on and thought it was over till our truck suddenly dipped from the bed. My uncle then started saying, "Look at me and don't turn away," over and over. Then I heard it again, tap, tap, but from the window behind me. It was getting harder for me to breathe and I wanted to cry. A minute or two passed and the truck dipped again. My uncle looked around and sighed. It was quiet besides the truck and the road. He looked at me and said, "We will ask your father to do a prayer in the morning, so the evil will forget our faces." Basically, that's the Navajo to English equivalent of what he had said. I remember curling up on the seat and just staring at the radio, watching the time go by, listening to my uncle sing an old prayer till we got to my grandmother's house. I called my uncle because I had a nightmare about that night. We talked about it for a bit, and he said, "I didn't see faces, just the eyes. Like brake lights you see on the road, it watched you." Before hanging up, I tried joking with him about it. "Why didn't you just step on the brake when it was in the back?" No laughter, just a pause from him. "Because it wasn't alone." As many of you might already know, many Navajo people, including my own family, are very reluctant to speak about skinwalkers because it is believed to attract their attention. Well, I, however, grew up away from the Navajo Nation and was very naive about the subject. When it came to skinwalkers, I was an absolute skeptic. My mom used to tell me a story of how back in the 80s, when she lived with her siblings and my grandparents, still in Shiprock but the southern outskirts, about how she and my aunt saw a skinwalker just outside their driveway under a streetlight. She described it as a black dog with dirty fur, a twisted noodle-like front leg, and these unnatural eyes with a soft, burnt orange glow. Me, being my own closed-minded self, doubted every word, but I never said my doubts aloud. But these doubts totally changed last year when I went to my grandparents' house last October. Me and my family had just finished scourging the carnival at the Navajo Nation Fair and called it a night. The house was close enough where we could walk home in just 10 minutes, so we did. When we got there, it was about 9 at night, where we stayed up until about 2, catching up about family affairs and the local news. It was during that time that I had just decidedly opened my mouth and blurted out the question, "Hey, are skinwalkers real? Guys?" I asked. "You shouldn't be speaking about that," my grandma said with the almost a disturbed yell in her voice, so she and my grandfather both decide to go to bed. After being scolded by my mom, one of my aunts chimes in with a very cautious tone and says, "They're real, all right. Had a few start screaming outside of my trailer in Farmington just a few nights ago. Your cousin had nightmares the whole night and woke up crying that morning." Not wanting to push the discomfort any further, we all decided to go to bed at this point. Now, the trailer/home is pretty old and it was a really nice night, So we slept with the windows open, the screens to prevent bugs coming in, of course. Everyone at this point had drifted off to sleep except me. Well, because my mind was still just going a million miles a minute about skinwalkers and wondered if I ever encounter one while here on the reservation. As a kid, I was told it's taboo to think about skinwalkers because it can still call their attention. That's when shit totally hit the fan for me. Just as I was settling and finally getting relaxed for sleep, I started to hear something moving outside. I get up from the couch and start wandering over to the kitchen window. In the trailer, all of the rooms have the lights out, so the only visible light that can be seen is from the porch light out front. I was thankful for this because I told myself if it really was a skinwalker outside, then hopefully it wouldn't notice me seeing it. So I muster up the courage and take a quick scan of outside. From the porch light, all I can see is the dusty ground and the vehicles that my family drove along with some of the old metal trash cans that stood beside the road. Looking for about a good 5 seconds, I wasn't able to see anything, so I was getting ready to turn around and walk back to bed, thinking it was just a stray cat or something. Only have taken 2 steps. I hear what sounds like a distorted scream coming from outside, definitely close by. The fear rising in me, I look outside again, and there I see it for the first time. A coyote-like figure was staring at my direction from behind the cars, just outside of the reach of the porch light. Only it looked awfully wrong and gave off an evil vibe just from seeing it. It was gray with very disheveled hair, and a horrific orange-red soft glow came from its eyes. I noped the hell out and ran back to the bedroom. It was at this moment I had begun to also notice an awful stench in the air that smelled kind of like rotting meat. I started trying to wake up my mother, who was like, "Oh my God, it's almost 3 a.m., what do you want?" I immediately began in a shaken voice, "There's something scary outside." And then she said, now annoyed because I woke her up, "Ugh, it's probably just a stray animal or something. It's the res. Animals wander all the time at night." She obviously wasn't getting the drift of what I was saying, so I screamed, "There's some Blair Witch Project shit going on outside, Ma." Well, that got her attention. What are you talking about?" she said, and then we heard it. The thing outside started making more of its dreadful like screams and started what sounded like thrashing outside on the ground. Hear that? That's what I'm talking about. So both her and I got back up and looked outside the window, and the coyote thing was making its way to the door. It walked with an odd limp and dragged its back right leg as if it was a handicap. We could hear it start to scratch against the door and make this odd, muffled moaning sound. My mom went and got my dad, and they both started shouting in Navajo all sorts of words, telling the thing to go away and saying it's not welcome here. Well, all this commotion was enough to get the rest of the trailer up as they came out into the hallway. The only thing my mom did was turn to them and said, "Skinwalker," while proceeding to point to the door, while the noises were still happening. Apparently, they already knew exactly what to do as my grandfather got out a handgun from the drawer and a bag of ashes. He coated a few bullets and loaded them into the gun and went straight to the door. Yelling out more Navajo that was too fast for me to even comprehend, he swung open the door and fired twice. Nothing. The thing managed to escape before my grandpa could even put a bullet in it. "That's the fastest one I've ever seen," said my grandpa. Next thing you know, my aunts and my parents are freaking out about what had just happened, saying stuff like, "What if it comes back tomorrow?" And "It saw us, does that mean we're targets now?" Afterwards, my grandparents calmed everyone down, myself included, saying that we'll be fine, and we all went to bed about 3-ish. Morning comes, and my grandparents call one of their neighbors and explain to them what had happened. Apparently, one of them was a medicine man who used to partake in Navajo ceremonies used for healing and curing sickness, and came over to bless each family member and the grounds outside. This is my father's story, written from his perspective. When I was about 11 or 12, we lived in a small house made of mud and stone. a lot like our house now. It was 2 of my brothers and I in the house. Everyone else had gone to Jimmy's Fest and left us to tend the sheep. We were getting ready for bed when we heard the dogs going crazy outside. Thinking it was nothing more than just coyotes howling in the distance, we told them to be quiet. We began to drift off into sleep and the dogs would not shut up. Somehow, I was able to go to sleep for a few hours. But then I woke up very late in the night. It was very quiet and still in the house, save for my brother snoring and breathing. I realized I needed to use the outhouse and woke up my brother to take me there. He teased me about being scared, which I certainly was. We went out with our flashlight to the outhouse, and the dogs began with their crazed barking in the sagebrush, going from one place to the next. My brother went first, and I waited outside for him. While waiting, I tried to follow the dogs with my flashlight. Suddenly, there was a very loud whine from one of the dogs, and then everything went quiet again. It was really too quiet for that time of year, to be honest. Not even the sheep were making any noises. Suddenly, I heard a few of the dogs going completely mad by the truck, and when I looked over, there was this man. He was unbelievably tall, leaning one arm on the cab roof of the truck. He was looking at the dogs for a little, and then suddenly kicking one of them. They all scattered in different directions. The thing looked up at me, and I saw its face. It had a pure white face, like a full moon, 2 burning red eyes, and a slight smile that was pure black. I could not move or make a sound. It began to walk toward me with a long stride, until it finally towered over me. All I began to see was a dark red, like the color of the blood when you cut the throat of a sheep. I kept getting deeper and deeper into its eyes. I could faintly hear my brother coming out of the outhouse. With this, the thing looked up at him. Reality came rushing back to me. I noticed that my brother was too distracted with his buckle to realize what was even going on. I also noticed this thing's long hands hovering just inches from my head. Its skin was black ash, and he smelled like a bloated dead animal in summer. I was still unable to move or speak. The skinwalker began to move toward my brother. Finally, noticing this figure, my brother became paralyzed as I was. Closer and closer it drew, reaching an arm outward toward my brother's head. And something finally snapped in me. I became unbearably angry. I broke from the trance and lunged at the skinwalker, raising my arms like a wild animal and baring my teeth at it. A growl came out that I never knew I could make. I became more and more angry at the thing that was trying to hurt us. It kept that smile at first, but the angrier I got, the more that smile faded. Finally, with everything I had, I began to make this primal roar at it. It fell backwards and ran into the night. Looking back at me, its eyes were dim and dull, its smile now long gone since what had happened. The next morning, the family returned home from the feast. After relaying the story to my parents, they quickly hired a medicine man. Whenever my mom would take us on a road trip to her hometown on the Navajo reservation, I'd occasionally ask her to tell me a skinwalker story along the way. I remember every story she's told me when we were driving through miles of nothing at night. Luckily, nothing ever happened to us during those drives. Anyway, this is one of those stories, and it came from my auntie. So my auntie and some of her friends used to party a lot back in the day. They'd hop up in a beaten-down van and drive out to the boondocks and just drink and have fun. Of course, this all took place on the Navajo reservation after sunset, and on this particular night, that's what they were doing. Everything was going good and whatnot when all of a sudden, they hear what sounds like rocks being thrown at their van. Everybody gets quiet as they wonder what the hell is going on. The sounds of rocks being thrown stops, and then suddenly, something jumps on top of the van roof. I should mention my family owned a white van that we would use for road trips because it had enough room for all of my brothers and me. So imagine a young me being told this story in a van. Terrifying. Everybody starts panicking as the realization sets in and hurry to lock every door. My auntie jumps in the driver's seat and tries to start the engine, but of course, the beaten down van refuses to start up. Whatever is on the roof is still up there making banging noises, and at this point, like it's jumping up and down. My auntie is freaking out when she then sees a hand with long nails reach over the roof and start scratching the windshield. At this point in the story, my mom would take one hand off the steering wheel and scratch the windshield to simulate it. Then, whatever was on the roof jumps off. Everyone is still freaking out, yelling at my auntie to start the van, and she keeps trying. And that's when she sees the skinwalker walk up to the driver's side window and stare at her just a few inches away. Well, that's when my auntie jumped in the back and started praying for her life. Minutes pass and the skinwalker appears to leave. My auntie hops back in the driver's seat and gets the van to start, and off they go. We live in a rural community on the Navajo reservation. My aunt and her 2 brothers were home alone while my grandparents had left for the evening to attend a chapter house meeting. They were in the house, and like many people from the reservation, they didn't have electricity. It had been dark outside for about an hour, and my aunt and my uncles were getting ready for bed. Outside, they heard noises, as if someone moving things around outside. My oldest uncle went to look out the front window and saw a figure out by the truck. This was immensely out of the ordinary because the closest neighbor was miles away. Whatever it was, though, opened the truck door and began to dig through the personal items that my family had left in the vehicle. My aunt and uncles were frightened by the sight and knew that they should take action. They took out the rifle and all steadied themselves to hold it up. They flung open the door and aimed the gun at the dark figure. The figure turned and started to walk towards them, totally unfazed by the weapon. My uncle pulled the trigger, but nothing happened. The figure just drew closer, and my aunt began to smell something like a rotting corpse. It was so strong it made her gag. My uncle continued to pull the trigger with no luck, and the figure came closer and closer. Off of the distance, headlights were coming up the road. My grandparents were luckily returning. The figure looked toward the lights and started to move away and tucked itself behind a tree near the house. My oldest uncle ran toward the truck with the gun, and my grandfather got out of the car and my uncle pointed to the tree. The thing was poking out its head to observe what they were doing. My grandfather ran into the house and over to the stove and grabbed a handful of ashes and rubbed over the gun and placed a ash-covered bullet into the chamber. He walked out onto the porch and fired toward the tree. Whatever that thing was didn't expect the gun to go off. The gunshot echoed and the dark figure began running. My grandmother chased my aunt inside, and my uncles and my grandfather went after it. There weren't many roads or paths, so as my grandfather and uncles chased after this thing, the truck was bouncing and the headlights were not fixed on the particular spot. My uncle swears that whenever the headlights would hit the figure, he saw a woman. But not only that, but whoever it was running on all fours like a bear. My grandfather eventually stopped the truck, and as they neared the ditch that drops about 20 feet, he got out and began to yell in Navajo. My uncle says that he was yelling about a local woman. He yelled that he wasn't scared and that he knew it was her and to leave his family alone. A few days had passed and there was news that the woman that my grandfather was yelling about had passed. I've always been told that if you know who the skinwalker is and say their name, it will kill them.